What I want to talk about today is one specific example that I hope encapsulates some of the issues that John raised so beautifully in his more comprehensive talk. And so by telling you the specifics about one particular emerging disease outbreak in one part of the world, I hope that we'll all spend a moment thinking a little bit about the ways in which food systems connect to aspects of human well-being that might not be immediately obvious. So my topic is how crop diseases impact global health, but informally you might call it a banana is not just a healthy snack. So bananas and plantains, which most of us think of as a kind of enjoyable extra that you might feel a little bit smug about eating, actually originated pretty far away from here. They came from Southeast Asia, the Philippines originally, but they have proved to be a really important and adaptable crop. And so as a result, they're now grown all over the tropics, in Latin America, in India, in Africa, and in much, of course, of Southeast Asia. Now, why were they so popular? Why are they so successful as a crop? Well, they're nutritious. They're full of carbohydrates and calories, especially the cooking bananas. And here when I say bananas, you should know that I'm talking not just about dessert bananas, the kind that we're used to, but cooking bananas, also known as plantains, which are arguably much more important in a global health scheme. And the plants are highly productive. You get a lot of food from a single plant in fairly short order. And the plants have turned out to be pretty adaptable. They grow under a lot of tropical circumstances, so you find them all over. If you travel in the tropics, one of the first plants that you learn to identify from the bus is a banana tree. You see them in people's yards, you see them as ornamentals, and you see them in big plantations, you see them in mixed agriculture farms like the one you see here. So it may not be immediately obvious, but this is actually a working production small plot farm. In the foreground there's corn, and then there's beans, and there's cassava plants planted in amongst, and then there are bananas trees in the background. So what might, to us, look pretty different from that 3,000-acre soybean field or cornfield that we think of as agriculture, this is where most of the world's people's food comes from, little mixed plots like this. So bananas, you might be surprised to learn, are the world's fourth most important food. They follow wheat, corn, and rice. So even though they aren't a big carbohydrate source for Americans, they are for much of the world. And less than 10% of the bananas that are grown locally, globally, and that amounts to an amazing 10 to the 12 kilograms per year. Those of us who are scientists, 10 to the 12th, that's not a number you come across very often unless you're an astronomer. So it turns out that only 10% of those are for the kinds of bananas that we're used to thinking about. The kinds that get grown in big plantations, get stamped with a sticker, put onto a boat, and sent to Woodman's for us to buy and eat. The other 90% are consumed within a few kilometers of where they're grown. They are a staple food. And we don't know much about them. Most of us have never even tasted them. But if you live in East Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, for example, bananas might be supplying 30 to 60% of your calories, depending on what part of the country you live in. And in addition, if you're a banana grower with more than just a couple of trees, you're probably selling some of your produce. And it's a key source of cash. You've got more than one kind of income. If you're living in a subsistence economy, you've probably got barter income and other kinds of support for your family. But cash is critical, and bananas offer an option to get there. And bananas are important in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, we now know, grows about a third of the world's bananas. And if you travel in Africa, you'll see them everywhere, getting transported around on big trucks sometimes, but also pretty frequently by muscle power. Ugandans, for example, eat on average 500 pounds of bananas a year. We don't eat 500 pounds of anything per year, not even high fructose corn syrup. So this is a diet that is forming a big part of the culture. How do you eat them, you might be wondering? Well, you make matoke, which is also an informal word for food, in much the way that rice functions as an informal word for food in a lot of Asia. You boil the bananas, and then you mash them, and now you've got matoke, and everybody likes it. It's African comfort food, not terribly exciting maybe, but it keeps you going from one day to the next. And it is not just carbohydrate. It's important to recognize this is also a source of a lot of micronutrients and minerals and vitamins. So things are not too bad among banana growers. In general, they're highly productive. Things are going great until about 2001. Now, bananas get a lot of diseases. But because they aren't originally from Africa, I told you before that they're originally from Southeast Asia, they were able to escape many of their pathogens when they moved to other parts of the world. And so, for the most part, people who grew bananas in Africa didn't have to worry too much about diseases attacking their crops. That changed about 10 years ago, when rather suddenly, a disease that nobody anywhere in the world had seen before began to attack bananas. First, it had no name, but we now call it banana Xanthomonas wilt, or BXW. And the symptoms you can see on this slide, the plants are collapsed, the leaves are brown and dead, and you're not going to be getting any fruit from these trees. So the symptoms as they first appear, you see yellowing leaves, which eventually turn brown and collapse, and you see fruit that gets ripe early, and in an important epidemiological clue, the male flowers of the banana plants are wilted. So here's another image. If you look over on your right, you'll see a hand of banana, or a bunch of bananas hanging from the tree, and that sort of sad-looking purple thing down at the bottom, that's the male flower. It's not supposed to look like that. Moreover, if you look up at that bunch, a couple of those bananas are already yellow. That's not supposed to be happening. And when you open the bananas up, they're inedible. They're rotting, disgusting, they have a bad taste. So you can't sell these. You can't eat them. Even the animals won't eat them. Now, who's responsible for this? It's a bacterium. Its name is Xanthomonas campestris, Pathovar musacearum, recently named because until recently, nobody had heard of or seen this bacterium. Or so we thought. So you see it growing on a plate. It belongs to a group of bacteria called xanthomonads that all of you have eaten. You might have noticed xanthan gum in some of your more highly processed foods. That's extracted from this group, this larger group of plant pathogenic bacteria. Turns out to be an industrially useful, very stable polysaccharide that can be used as a lubricant for machines that operate at high temperatures and also to keep cosmetics and ice cream stable. It's non-toxic, apart from the ish factor. There's nothing wrong with eating it. But it also produces these characteristic goopy yellow colonies. So as soon as somebody isolated this bacterium, they said, oh, I bet it belongs in the group Xanthomonas, but this is a new one that we haven't seen before. The first symptom, as I mentioned, is often this wilted male flower. Now, why is that? It turns out to be because insects move this disease around. Pollinating insects visit male flowers to pick up pollen, and they, at the same time, deposit this bacterium that they have picked up from other plants that were infected. So really, this is, if you will, a venereal disease. It's transmitted from plant to plant during sex. Not by direct contact, the way that we like to do it, but nevertheless, with the insect acting as a kind of third party, you're actually using the sexual process to transmit disease. So a healthy male flower on your left is a nice looking thing, but the one that you see over on the right is infected, it's dark, it's wilted, it's unhealthy. The plant is going to get sick, and moreover, look at this. You cut the plant stem in half, and you see this yellow ooze, a pure culture of the bacterium basically, that just comes bubbling up out of the vascular tissue of this poor plant. It's so heavily colonized, no wonder it's wilting. And moreover, this explains another way that this pathogen gets transmitted. Because when people cut down their trees, or when they cut off a hand of bananas, or when they trim, they use a machete. And this machete picks up the bacteria, and then the next tree that they cut essentially gets inoculated. So humans and pollinating insects are the way that this pathogen gets around. And indeed, it got around pretty fast. After just 5 years, it was spread very widely around the so-called Great Lakes region of Africa. So what you're looking at, that big lake you're looking at in the center is Lake Victoria, and it was more than 80% incidence, that is 80% of plantings were affected in many parts of Uganda, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and also a little bit in Rwanda and Burundi. This is a part of the world where bananas, as I mentioned, are a key food source. So this had a big human impact. It's estimated that there was a production loss of about 53%. So imagine if 53% of the corn in the United States went away in 5 years. There would be major market disruptions. We'd be okay. I don't think people would go hungry because we have a pretty diversified diet, even though corn plays a big role in it. That was not the case, unfortunately, in East Africa, where in addition to the about $8 billion that's estimated to have been lost, there were significant effects on subsistence farmers and people in the city who suddenly contended with a near doubling in the price of their staple food because the loss of production resulted in an increase in the price. So in a small African banana plantation, a crop disease like this is a family catastrophe. There were significant human impacts that went beyond what you would ordinarily think of in terms of a perhaps relatively minor seeming plant disease. So if I told you a few minutes ago that a disease of bananas was a global health concern, you might have been dubious, but I hope you're now persuaded that food insecurity, when you rely on a single crop like this, really can have a lot of serious impacts. And indeed, things have been described in Uganda in particular, where a good deal of this research has been done, that include not only food insecurity, which is a polite and academic way of saying people going hungry, and making major life decisions to try to avoid that hunger. There's also been a lot of internal migrations, people moving from the farms to the cities, often with hopes but no real prospects of finding a job where they could get money so that they could buy bananas, feed their families. And particularly important in terms of long-term effects, kids leaving school. Schools are nominally public in most of these countries, but in fact, they rely on a lot of financial security. You have to be able to pay minor school fees. You have to be able to get uniforms for your kids in many cases. You have to have shoes so your kids can go to school. And most importantly, maybe for many of these families, you have to be able to spare the child's daily labor because farms like this rely on family labor. So let's talk about this in terms of origin. It seemed like this disease came out of nowhere. But in fact, if you take a good look at this map of Africa, you'll see that not too far from Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, these banana-reliant countries where this disease became so important, is the country of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is also a place where bananas are grown, but in addition, there's a native crop that's grown in Ethiopia. And that's one that most of us probably hadn't heard of until today, and that's enset. Enset is a relative of bananas. It's from Africa to start with, and its fruit are not of interest. People grow it because it makes a big starchy root that's also a good food source. So this is an important traditional crop, understood and studied by very few people. But when this banana disease broke out and people went back into the literature and began poking around, they found a paper published in a minor journal in 1968 that described a disease called enset wilt. It didn't seem to be a very important disease. There are only 2 papers on it in the literature, as far as I know. Nobody cared because hardly anybody knew anything about enset, and it wasn't having a huge effect. But the disease is still around, and when people went back and took a closer look at infected enset plants, and in particular, when they cut the stems open, they saw this yellow ooze. Look familiar? Yep. It's a very close relative, in fact, probably an ancestor of the banana Xanthomonas wilt pathogen. And so now By great good luck, it turned out that the British researcher who had worked with the Ethiopian researcher who initially described the NSET disease had actually cataloged and archived a strain from that 1968 outbreak. So with genome sequencing, it was possible to pull that strain out of culture and sequence the genome of the old NSET wilt strain and of the newly emerged banana Xanthomonas wilt strain. They're not identical. Something happened that allowed this organism to make a species jump from the plant that it had co-evolved with in East Africa, the NSET plant, to a new plant that it had never seen before until human beings brought it from Southeast Asia and planted it in huge volumes all around sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world too. We created, with this monoculture and with this movement of crops, the ideal situation for the evolution of a new pathogen. And every time we grow crops in huge monoculture, we're asking for it. Because pathogens are very adaptable. They multiply a lot faster than our plants do. In many cases, they even have within the mechanisms that allow them to mutate quickly and adapt to new hosts. So as we move crops around the world, as we create monocultural systems, we're disturbing ecosystem health, those ecosystem services that John Patz talked about that are supporting our own health, perhaps directly by protecting us from diseases that might attack us, but we're also upsetting our ecosystems in ways that invite crop epidemics that indirectly cause human health consequences by affecting our the crops on which we depend. So this, for a molecular biology geek like myself, this is really cool because it holds the promise that we're going to be able to go into these two genomes and figure out what the handful of genes that are different actually do that allow this particular bacterium to go from attacking in a minor way, a traditional plant that was native to Africa to suddenly causing a devastating, sweeping, emerging epidemic on an imported new plant. But let's get back to those people who have to deal with this. How do you control this disease? Well, some of the more obvious methods aren't available. There's no chemical treatment that works against this. You can't spray with a fungicide because it's not a fungus, it's a bacterium. There are no other chemicals that seem to work against it, in part because it's sheltered inside the plant, so spraying something on the leaves won't have any effect. And all the banana varieties that people are growing in Africa, and these range from the cooking bananas that I described to an important use of bananas that I didn't mention, namely fermentation. So if you've ever been to East Africa, maybe you've had the pleasure of drinking banana beer. It's different from Point or New Glarus, but it is beer and it's economically important. So the banana beer varieties, the ripe dessert banana varieties, and the cooking banana varieties are all susceptible to this disease. So for the moment anyway, there doesn't seem to be a conventional breeding way to create a new variety of bananas that are resistant. Now we do have another option. Researchers working at Makerere University and IITA in and near Kampala, Uganda, have developed a genetically modified banana that looks like it's going to have resistance to BXW. It's got a gene from peppers that got moved over into bananas, and it seems to confer disease resistance. But first of all, this is a long way from actually being applied. It'll probably take years before it's ready to go out into the field. And secondly, East Africans are not sure if they want to eat genetically modified crops. There's anxiety associated with it in a sort of general way that most people around the world share. And then in addition, it's useful to remember that much of that part of Africa was originally colonized by the British, and there remains a strong British cultural influence. And the British, along with other Europeans, have very high levels of anxiety about accepting GMO foods. So this solution may not be socially acceptable, even if it's technically feasible. It remains to be seen. So there are a few genetically modified banana plants being tested now in Uganda, but you can see they're behind a fence and they're protected and they're prominently labeled research only, not for food. Now there are ways to control this, but they all have to be executed by a grower who understands the disease and understands how to do these things. So grower education is the key to trying to get this disease under control. You have to plant healthy cuttings so that you're not starting off with diseased plants. You need to snap off the male flowers as soon as the fruits start to form. You can just do that with a stick. You need to watch for the symptoms. You need to know what the symptoms look like, and then when they appear, you need to pull up the tree, bury it, and leave that area unplanted for 6 months so that the bacteria will die. If you faithfully follow these instructions, you can reduce the disease incidence, and it's been shown that it can go down from that 80% high that I showed you on the map to as low as 10%. In other words, you can get back to getting a normal yield or something close to it of bananas. Okay, all of this is if the grower understands how to control the disease. And here's where we get to another multidisciplinary aspect. Technological solutions here aren't enough. You've got to communicate with these growers. And recall, many of them don't have high school diploma, they're not big readers, they don't necessarily read the papers. There isn't a big extension service that can go around and talk to all these growers in remote areas. You have to find some other way of reaching them. And I found out what way is in common use there in a sort of incidental way. So when I first arrived in Uganda for the first time, I was all full of excitement about learning about banana Xanthomonas wilt. And when I got into the taxi at Entebbe Airport, the guy who was driving my taxi, a suave urban young man, asked me what I was doing in Uganda, and I launched into my spiel about banana wilt. Ah, he said, I've heard about that. I said, oh, you have? He said, yes, it's causing big problems. I said, yeah, it is. So even you've heard about that, you're a city dweller. Or maybe you've got family in the country? He said, no, all my family lives in the city. And I said, so what do you know about banana Xanthomonas wilt? He said, well, it's caused by a little microbe, and you can control it if you just snap off the male flowers. And if you do get a wilted tree, you can just dig it up and bury it, and it's okay to plant again after 6 months. I said, how do you know that? I thought, wow, somebody really got wonderful education going. I said, maybe you've got a relative who's a scientist? Oh, no, he said, I listen to the radio. And then he told me about a brilliant extension policy that was being employed. The Ugandan Extension Service had developed an utterly scandalous and addictive soap opera that ran every afternoon right about the time that people would stop for lunch on the radio stations. And it involved a large, complicated, and very badly behaved family. And they went from one awful exploit to the next. But in the process of plotting to poison each other, running off with each other's wives, contracting HIV, they had all sorts of little asides in which key information about human health, about nutrition, and about protecting agriculture from agricultural pests was embedded. And so, they'd be talking to each other, darling, we must run off, but first, get your husband's money, and also, don't forget to snap off the wilting male flowers. So, I mean, I realize that something like that can be very effective in any context. So I'm imagining reality TV shows, for example, here in the US that encourage people to do all sorts of desirable things. So my main point here is that having a technical solution to this problem wasn't enough. You had to find some way to effectively teach, to engage people and get them to understand by whatever means works. And that's the point at which scientists need to find ways of working effectively with communication skilled and trained people across the disciplines, the humanities, the philosophical framework people, economists, rural sociologists, a whole variety of much more broadly framed thinkers than we typically are. And I think it won't be a big surprise if I tell you that many scientists are not all that socially adept. And so that makes it especially pressing that problems like this that are fundamentally human in origin, even though they appear to be proximally caused by a biological issue, have to be addressed across the disciplines. So that's my larger point that I'll leave you with. And I hope that also the next time you eat a banana, you stop and think a moment about the larger role of bananas in our global food system.